Here's our first story, The Buried Brain. Noah Schneider felt a rush of excitement as he glided on his skis down the side of a mountain. It was November of 2008, and the 25-year-old from Munich, Germany, had spent the past few days at a ski resort happily racing through the snow with his friend Simon. Noah came to a stop and paused to enjoy the view. He and Simon were far away from the resort. They were out in the backcountry, where the terrain was much more rugged. Noah loved how wild the backcountry was, and how the surrounding forests filled the air with the smell of pine sap. Noah looked up above him and saw Simon was working his way down the slope as well. Noah was ready to get going, so Noah took a deep breath and then launched himself down a wide-open snowfield full of deep powder. But just a few turns later, he felt the snow under his feet begin to shift, and then suddenly it completely gave out underneath him. Noah's heart leapt into his throat as he was pulled down into a river of snow. Then the snow loosened and began to slide down the mountain. It was an avalanche, and there was nothing he could do to get out of it. Noah tried as hard as he could to try to find the way up to get his head out of the snow, but he was flailing his arms, and as the momentum turned his body from side to side, he was left feeling totally disoriented. He could feel himself rushing down the mountain, but the snow had now blocked out the sun, and it was too dark to see anything, so he had no idea where he was and what direction was what. Noah wanted to scream and try to get someone to hear him, but as the avalanche grew, as it rushed down the mountain, the weight of all the new snow piling on began pressing down on his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe, let alone speak or yell. Noah knew if he couldn't get out of here, he would be buried alive. And so, as Noah tumbled down the mountain inside of that dark snow, he was left thinking of his family and friends who he would never see again. But the next thing Noah heard was a soft and steady beeping. He faded in and out of consciousness as he slowly came to, but then he began to recognize the rhythmic whirring and buzzing of what sounded like medical devices. His head was pounding and his eyelids were heavy, but he managed to open them just enough to take in his surroundings. He was propped up in a bed in a beige, clinical-looking room he didn't recognize. Next to him, a blue curtain was drawn, cutting the room in half. Noah realized he was in a hospital. He had somehow survived. He just had no idea how he actually had survived or how he had wound up here. A few moments later, Noah heard approaching footsteps on the tile floor. He opened his right eye just a sliver, and he saw a tall woman wearing scrubs handling one of the machines near his bed. He tried to say something to her, but when he opened his mouth, no words came out. He just basically breathed out, and that was it. But him breathing out was actually enough to get the nurse's attention. She looked over at him and smiled, and told Noah she was glad to see him awake. Noah swallowed, which actually hurt a lot. It felt like his entire trachea was bruised. But he tried to speak again, and this time he was able to whisper something. He asked her what happened. The nurse explained that the previous day, Noah had been caught in that avalanche, and then he was trapped under the snow for about 15 minutes. But luckily for Noah, his friend Simon, who was a paramedic, had been able to find him, dig him out, and perform CPR. That had saved his life. Noah slowly nodded, and then suddenly understood why it hurt so much to breathe. He'd seen Simon perform CPR before, and he knew that chest compressions could be hard enough to crack a rib, and so maybe that's what happened to him. The nurse told Noah that he had been flown to the hospital by helicopter, but by the time he landed, he was barely alive. He had a ruptured spleen and a hip fracture, and for a long time while he was crushed under the snow, he hadn't been breathing. The nurse explained that that's called hypoxia, when there's no oxygen getting to the brain, and she said that, frankly, the hospital staff could not believe he had made it out alive with that much time without oxygen. Noah didn't quite know what to say, so he stayed quiet. The nurse didn't seem to mind. She just told him to rest, and that it would take him a while to recover fully from this kind of accident. Noah gave her a half smile and then closed his eyes and went to sleep. Several weeks later, Noah gritted his teeth as he tried to stand upright while holding on to some parallel bars. He had been at a rehab facility near Munich for a few days, and so far, he liked his new surroundings. It was quieter than the hospital, which made it easier to relax and sleep. Plus, he had physical therapy sessions every morning, which he knew were helping him regain his strength. Noah kept his eyes on his physical therapist, who was standing at the end of the bars, as he inched his way along toward her. His fractured hip was really burning from muscle exhaustion, But Noah kinda loved the challenge. When he first got to the rehab center, he'd been barely able to sit upright in a chair. But he'd been pushing himself every day, and now he could almost make it down the whole 10-foot-long section of bars before he had to collapse back into his wheelchair. Noah hoped he'd be upright and walking again by the end of February. That way, he could get back to school and finish his studies. So he willed himself to keep on going down the bars. When he finally reached the end of the bars, his physical therapist helped him sit down in his wheelchair and then gave him a high five. Noah smiled and leaned his head back, feeling proud of himself. It was the first time he'd gone the entire length of the bars, and he'd only been at the rehab facility for 3 days, and so he was hopeful he'd be able to be discharged much sooner than he thought. An hour later, Noah leaned back on the bed in his room, watching TV and opening a care package that his friends had sent him. He was grateful for the distraction. Aside from his morning therapy sessions, he had the whole day to himself, and so Noah was feeling pretty bored. He sorted through the box, and then pulled out the packages of nuts and snacks, a little container of homemade cookies, an adult coloring book, and a big book of Sudoku puzzles. Sudokus are puzzles where players put numbers into a grid that contains a total of 81 squares. The idea is to fill every row, column, and group of 9 squares with the numbers 1 through 9 without repeating them. Noah's face lit up when he saw the Sudoku puzzles. He liked solving them, and it was a lot more mentally stimulating than the boring TV reruns he'd been watching. Normally, he'd be in school and studying at this time of the day, but it was winter break and all of his books were back home, so he'd been running out of ways to keep himself occupied. He opened up a bag of gummy worms and popped one in his mouth, then rummaged through the box and found a pencil. Then he opened up his Sudoku book and began his first puzzle. But as he started filling in the boxes with his right hand, the fingers on his left hand started feeling shaky. He finally put the pencil down and tried to steady his left hand, but then his entire left arm just began convulsing. Noah reached for the call button with his right hand, which still felt normal. Then he grabbed his left arm with his right and just tried to hold it in place and stop it from shaking. But his arm just kept on convulsing, and so he took a deep breath and told himself, "It's okay, this is not a big deal, I'm gonna be fine." And just then, his left arm stopped convulsing and was just back to normal. As a nurse came flying into the room to see what was going on, Noah just stared down at his left arm in disbelief. The nurse asked him what was wrong, and he explained that he was pretty sure his left arm had just had a seizure, but now it had stopped. Noah kinda hugged his left arm to his chest and told the nurse that actually his left arm now felt sore. She nodded, but told him that unfortunately, there really wasn't much she could do about his arm. So she told him she would go inform his doctor about what happened to see if maybe she wanted to run some tests. Noah smiled and nodded, but inside, he was feeling very anxious. To this point, his recovery had been really nothing but steady progress, but now it felt like this was the first time he was kind of backsliding. The next morning, after he finished his physical therapy session, Noah asked his nurse to wheel him into the cafeteria for breakfast. She said yes and rolled him up to his usual table, then told him he could relax while she grabbed him some food. While he waited, Noah took out his Sudoku book. He picked up his pencil and flipped to the puzzle that he'd started yesterday before his seizure. He looked over the empty boxes and then began counting through different ways of solving the puzzle. But as he worked on this puzzle, just like the day before, there was this jolt of energy that kind of burst through his left arm, and then his arm was shaking and spasming all over again. One of the patients sitting at his table asked Noah if he needed help, and Noah, who was terrified, just nodded, and then he heard the patient call a nurse over. The shaking moved up Noah's left arm and kept shaking even when he grabbed it with his right hand. He could hear movement all around him, and he knew the entire dining hall was now looking over at him. Noah leaned back in his chair, still clutching his left arm, right as his nurse arrived. And when she did, Noah took a deep breath and then made eye contact with her, doing his best to try to breathe deeply and evenly and try to block out everything else around him. He was basically trying to stop panicking. And as he focused on just the nurse's face and on his breathing, slowly the shaking in his left arm actually dissipated. After Noah told the nurse that, his left arm was back to normal, the nurse bent over him, kind of puzzled, and inspected his arm, and then she asked him if the seizure he had just felt like the one from the day before. And Noah nodded and said, yeah, it felt identical. The nurse nodded and told him to wait right there. She was going to grab Noah's doctor immediately. A few minutes later, Noah sat on his bed while his doctor took his vitals. She shone a flashlight in his eyes, then asked him to follow the movement of her finger while she drew a big square in the air in front of him. After following her finger for a moment, she put it down, and Noah gave the doctor a half smile and kind of wrapped his fingers on his knees, which was something he did when he was nervous. He watched as the doctor scribbled a few notes, then she asked him to tell her what he remembered of the seizures. What was he doing right before they started? What was he thinking about? How was he feeling? Noah told her that both times he had this seizure in his left arm, he'd been eating something and also doing a Sudoku puzzle. He'd felt relatively calm, almost bored before it happened. His back had felt a little sore during the seizures, but he thought that was just from how much he had been sitting and lying down recently. He couldn't remember what he had been thinking about before the seizures, so he told the doctor that he really wasn't thinking about anything. He was just trying to solve these puzzles. The doctor thought for a second, and then told Noah that she'd actually like to try to recreate the moments right before the seizures as best as they could. So she grabbed a Sudoku book from the bedside table and handed it to him, and asked him to start solving a puzzle. Noah nodded and opened up the book to the puzzle that he'd earmarked, and almost as soon as he began trying to solve it, his left arm began to visibly spasm. He looked up at the doctor, who was staring back at him in total disbelief. She told him she was calling a neurologist right now. The next day, Baron Feddersen, who was a neurologist, looked in on his new patient from the hallway of the neurology wing at the University of Munich. Through a glass window, he could see Noah in a hospital room filling out a worksheet of complex math problems and also a crossword puzzle. Dr. Feddersen suspected that Noah's seizures were somehow being triggered when Noah tried to solve puzzles. He watched as Noah worked on the math problems, expecting his left arm to begin shaking, just like when he had solved the Sudoku puzzles. But after about 10 minutes of doing these math problems, Noah's left arm was steady, and so was his right. He finished his worksheets, then put his pencil down and looked up at Dr. Feddersen through the window. Dr. Feddersen frowned. He had been so sure that it was just trying to do math that would cause Noah's arm to seize. But clearly it was not just math, because that didn't do anything. So Dr. Feddersen decided that Noah should try another Sudoku puzzle, because maybe it was just Sudoku that triggered his seizure. So the doctor brought a Sudoku puzzle into the room, and he watched as Noah began to solve it, and within moments, Noah's left hand began to shake uncontrollably. Once the seizure had passed and Dr. Feddersen was sure Noah was okay again, he took a step back and just thought for a second. There had to be something unique about these Sudoku puzzles that was causing these seizures. But the doctor just could not understand what that kind of X factor was. What was it about Sudoku puzzles that was triggering this reaction from Noah? I mean, the doctor had never heard of a case like this in all his many, many years of practicing neurology. Finally, the doctor told Noah he'd be right back. He needed to go run some tests. 30 minutes later, Dr. Feddersen watched as a nurse secured a cap containing sensors and wires to Noah's head. Then Dr. Feddersen turned his attention to his computer screen right as the nurse handed Noah a Sudoku puzzle. As Noah began working on the Sudoku puzzle, Dr. Feddersen watched squiggly lines appear on his monitor. These were Noah's brain waves, and at first, Noah's brain activity looked completely normal. Then, a section right in the middle of the screen, right in the center of Noah's brain, began to light up, just as his left arm began to shake. Noah put his pencil down as the nurse moved a bit closer, and within a few moments, the seizure stopped, and his brain waves went back to normal. Reviewing the chart, Dr. Feddersen could see Noah had just suffered a classic seizure. But there was one little piece of brain activity that caught Dr. Feddersen's eye, and he realized he needed to ask Noah some questions about the way he solved Sudoku puzzles. And what he learned shocked and amazed him. It turned out that Noah pictured the Sudoku numbers in a three-dimensional grid, like a big blank cube that he could fill with numbers. Imagining the puzzle that way activated the part of his brain used for spatial reasoning called the parietal lobe. During the avalanche, while Noah was buried under the snow and unable to breathe for 15 minutes, the lack of oxygen had killed neurons in this part of his brain. So now, when he tried to use spatial reasoning to solve these Sudoku puzzles, he was overstimulating his parietal lobe, which caused a seizure. And because he did not think in 3 dimensions when he did simple math problems or crossword puzzles, those didn't trigger a reaction at all. Dr. Feddersen told Noah that there was no cure for these seizures, but he might be able to keep doing Sudoku if he imagined the numbers in a more traditional 2-dimensional way. But Noah actually was not able to work on the puzzles that way. He was too rooted in the way he typically solved these puzzles, and so ultimately he just gave up Sudoku altogether. After that, Noah's seizures disappeared, and he was able to leave the rehab facility a few weeks later. Other than giving up Sudoku, one of his favorite games, he would make close to a full recovery. Here is our second story called Killer Jetlag. On July 3rd, 2010, Kelly Granger walked out of the arrivals gate at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. She had a huge smile on her face, not just because she was happy to be home after more than 6 weeks away, but because her travels had changed her life. After finishing her sophomore year of college, 19-year-old Kelly had gone abroad for study in the African nation of Ghana. Kelly was an anthropology major, and she'd studied modern and traditional Ghanaian life while also volunteering to help Ghanaian people in need. On weekends, she and her classmates had traveled all over the country. She'd made some local friends she hoped to stay in touch with forever. All in all, this trip had been one of the best times of her entire life. Kelly made her way to the baggage claim area, where her family was already waiting for her. She already missed Ghana, but she had to admit that it was good to be back in New York and to feel the warm embrace of her mom and dad. She was also exhausted and ready to get home and sleep off the jet lag after crossing 4 time zones during her long flight. But over the next few days, Kelly had trouble shaking off her fatigue, and she had a very persistent headache. She figured these things would just go away once she got fully readjusted to being back in this time zone, but when Kelly woke up on the 5th morning after she got back, her headache was worse than ever. She rolled over and realized she was drenched in sweat. In fact, she was feeling so sick, she couldn't even get out of bed. So she wrapped her comforter around her more tightly and called for her mom, Gina. Then she laid in bed shivering with her eyes closed until she heard her mom come into her room and sit beside her on the bed. After her mom put a hand on Kelly's forehead and felt how warm she was, she told Kelly she was going to take her to the doctor. Gina just had a feeling that whatever was going on with her daughter seemed more serious than just jet lag or a little bug she'd caught on the way home, and so she wasn't going to take any chances. That afternoon, Kelly sat on her doctor's examination table with a thermometer in her mouth. She kept her eyes closed, as though that might get rid of the terrible headache that was pounding in her temples. Her doctor asked her if she was on any medications, and Kelly shrugged, as if to say, sort of. While she was in Ghana, she had been taking a malaria prevention medication called mefloquine, but she'd stopped taking it when she left, even though that was kind of recently, and since then she had not taken anything else. Suddenly, the thermometer beeped, and so the doctor gently pulled it out of Kelly's mouth. He told Kelly she did have a mild fever, but nothing too alarming. Then he quizzed Kelly about whether she had always remembered to take her anti-malaria pills. Mefloquine is highly effective, he said, but only if you take it every single week. You can't miss taking it. Kelly's mind was fuzzy from her headache, but she felt positive she'd taken the medication. Her school had made a big point of reminding her and everybody else that they had to take it every single week. The doctor nodded and sat back in silence for a moment, and then he told Kelly and her mom that this looked like just a very bad case of jet lag. In some people, that groggy feeling can last for a week or more, and the best treatment is just to rest. And so the doctor told Kelly to go home and rest and come back in a week if she still didn't feel better. 2 nights later, Kelly rolled from side to side in her bed. It was nearly 3 a.m., and while she was usually a sound sleeper, this night her headache and nausea were so bad she was finding it really hard to sleep. It also felt like her fever was spiking, and her chills were so bad that her teeth were actually chattering, but every time she pulled her comforter around her to warm herself up, she'd start to sweat. It was like she was alternating between being stuck in a furnace and a freezer. Finally, out of just sheer exhaustion, she did begin to drift off to sleep. And all of a sudden, Kelly heard a low voice calling out to her from somewhere in her bedroom, and it was saying something extremely strange and kind of threatening. She would soon be moving on to the next step, the voice said, but it warned Kelly not to tell anyone or she'd be sorry. Kelly was so scared that she jolted awake. But there was no one in her room, and her room seemed totally normal. Morning light filtered through her curtains, bathing her room in a reassuring glow. But Kelly still felt terrible and clammy and cold, and she was even panting like someone had just been chasing her. She told herself whatever had just happened had to have just been a bad dream. But at the same time, Kelly did not want to be alone right now. So she got out of bed and went downstairs where she could hear her mom and sister in the kitchen making breakfast. Kelly's mom looked up when she went into the kitchen and she asked Kelly how she slept. Kelly wanted to give an honest answer about this weird voice she heard in her room that maybe was in her dream and maybe wasn't. But then she remembered what that weird voice had actually said. Basically, don't tell anyone about the voice. Now, Kelly was not superstitious, but for some reason, she obeyed the voice's commands. So without mentioning the voice to anybody, Kelly just sat down at the kitchen table and said she slept just fine. The next morning, Kelly awoke in a cold sweat again, clutching her chest. The deep voice was back again, telling her she was nearly ready for the next step. Kelly couldn't help but feel scared, even as she told herself that, probably her fever was responsible for making her dreams so vivid, to include strange voices. But regardless, Kelly got out of bed to go brush her teeth. However, when she got to her bedroom doorway, she stopped. She looked down the hallway and realized she had no idea where the bathroom was. She looked at the other doors in the hallway and the stairs leading down to the foyer, but somehow nothing looked familiar. For a moment, she wondered if she was actually still asleep. But no, she was not. This was no dream. As Kelly began walking down the hallway, the floor began to move, knocking her off balance. She fell into the wall, then held it for support as she stood upright. She tried to walk again, but now the walls were bending and warping. The stairs began to slide away from her, and each door in the hallway slowly moved up and down and up onto the ceiling. Kelly kept trying to get her footing, but every couple of steps, she just hit the wall again. It was like the walls were jumping out to knock her off balance. So Kelly sank down onto all fours and began to crawl to the steps that led downstairs, where she knew her mother would be. When she reached the stairs, Kelly closed her eyes and sat on the top step. Then slowly she began to slide down each stair almost like a slide. Finally, she reached the bottom of the stairs and felt the hardwood floor beneath her feet, and at this point, she was able to actually stand. And right away, she thought to herself, I need to find my mom. Gina was standing over the stove scrambling eggs when Kelly came into the kitchen with a blank look on her face and totally covered in sweat. As Kelly walked toward her mother, she kind of staggered into the wall. Gina exchanged confused glances with her other daughter, Jessica, who was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for eggs. And then Kelly stumbled over to the table too and sat down, staring at the wall. Not really sure what was going on with her daughter, Gina just asked Kelly if she'd like some scrambled eggs too. But Kelly didn't answer. Instead, she began mumbling under her breath, speaking nonsense and still just staring at the wall like she was having a full conversation with someone Gina couldn't see. Gina called Kelly's name, trying to get her attention, and asked who she was talking to, but Kelly did not seem to hear her. Gina turned off the stove and walked over to Kelly and put a hand on her forehead, and she could tell she was warm to the touch. And so between that and the fact that Kelly was basically not responsive, told Gina this was an emergency. Gina did her best to stay calm, and as she went to grab her purse, she told her other daughter, Jessica, to get her shoes on, because they were going to take Kelly to the doctor's office. But when Gina tried to guide Kelly from the kitchen table towards the front door, she could see Kelly basically couldn't stand. She was very unsteady. And so at this point, Gina said, you know what? We're not going to the doctor's office. We're going to the hospital's emergency room right now. Later that morning, Gina stood in the corner of a hospital room at the Cohen Children's Medical Center on Long Island, New York. She hugged herself nervously as she watched an ER doctor and a triage nurse perform a head-to-toe examination of Kelly. Gina thought Kelly looked absolutely terrible. Under the bright fluorescent lights in the ceiling, Kelly's skin and eyes looked yellow, a condition Gina knew was called jaundice, but Gina had never seen it in person before. A moment later, the doctor confirmed that Kelly did have jaundice, and that could be a sign that she had a blood disease or a liver infection like hepatitis B. The doctor explained to Gina that he would have to call in an infectious disease specialist to take over Kelly's case because jaundice could be life-threatening. Gina felt a knot form in her stomach, and the feeling only grew when she looked over at Kelly's terrified face. Kelly was not entirely lucid, but it looked like she just heard what the doctor said and understood that whatever was wrong with her was quickly turning dangerous. Gina thanked the doctor as he stepped out of the room. Then she sat on the edge of Kelly's bed and held her daughter's hand while they waited for the specialist. Minutes passed, and the longer they waited, the more Kelly seemed to slip farther and farther away from reality. Her eyes were roving around the room without really focusing on anything. Gina tried to get Kelly's attention over and over again, but her daughter just kept kind of looking around and sort of babbling. By the time the specialist finally knocked on the door, Kelly seemed fully delirious. The specialist introduced himself as Dr. Sunil Sood, but Gina did not waste time introducing herself. Instead, she just hopped off the bed and directed Dr. Sood to Kelly and said, "Please help her." Dr. Sood walked across the room and immediately began assessing Kelly. After just a few moments, he turned to Gina and confirmed that Kelly did seem delirious, which unfortunately was a very bad sign. It meant that whatever Kelly had was rapidly evolving and now causing neurological complications. The doctor said he needed to order a full blood workup right away and hoped it would tell him what was wrong with Kelly. 45 minutes later, Gina, Jessica, and Kelly's father, Albert, paced in the waiting room until Gina finally spotted Dr. Sood walking down the hallway toward them. Gina held on to Albert for support as Dr. Sood cleared his voice and then explained to the parents that he did know what was wrong with Kelly. She had malaria. Gina shook her head. That was impossible. She promised Dr. Sood that Kelly had taken the medicine to prevent malaria while she was in Ghana. She asked him if maybe this could be something else. But the doctor said there was absolutely no mistaking malaria for something else under the microscope. He wasn't sure how this happened, but Kelly's blood was full of the parasites that cause malaria. These parasites were attacking her red blood cells, and in response, her immune system had launched a massive counterattack to fight the malaria off. But now, the battle between the disease and Kelly's immune system had caused such intense inflammation that her heart, liver, and other organs were in danger of failing. Dr. Sood explained that normally malaria could be treated with drugs. But at this point, Kelly had such a huge number of these malaria-causing parasites in her body that no drug would be able to kill them all without also killing Kelly. There was only one treatment that might help Kelly, however, it was drastic. Instead of trying to treat the disease with drugs, Dr. Sood proposed actually removing the infected blood cells from Kelly's body and replacing them with healthy donated blood. But to do that, Dr. Sood needed to remove up to 3/4 of the blood in Kelly's body and replace it with clean, healthy blood. The healthy blood, coupled with antibiotics, could then fight off the rest of the infection. The doctor admitted this was sort of a long shot, but it was very likely Kelly's only shot at survival. Dr. Sood assured the family that the health risks of actually replacing Kelly's blood with other blood were relatively low, but it was far less clear whether this procedure would actually allow her to successfully fight off the malaria. And so, for the next several hours, Gina sat by her daughter's bedside as the infected blood was extracted from her body and the new blood was fed back into her body through other tubes. The entire time, Gina prayed as she never had before. Finally, the last of the new blood trickled into Kelly's arm, and all of the bad blood was out by this point, and so Dr. Sood came back into the room to tell Gina that Kelly's procedure was now over. And so now her daughter would stay unconscious for a while as her body adjusted, and then everybody would just have to wait at least several hours to see if this procedure had actually worked. After 3 long, anxious hours of waiting, Kelly's mother, Gina, could hardly stand it anymore. So she stood up and announced she was going to get some coffee from the vending machine. Basically, she just needed to do something to take her mind off this waiting. But just as Gina picked up her purse to leave, she heard a rustling noise coming from the bed. She whipped around and looked at her daughter, and Kelly's eyes were wide open and focused. She was looking at her father, and she smiled and said hi to him as though she'd just woken up from a nap. A few moments later, Dr. Sood strode into Kelly's hospital room and told Kelly and her family that the blood replacement strategy had worked. The malaria parasites were rapidly disappearing from her body. Gina smiled at him and thanked him over and over again for saving her daughter. But there was one thing that still didn't make any sense to her. She didn't understand how her daughter could have gotten malaria in the first place. Just then, Kelly cleared her throat. She was finally clear-headed enough to remember everything about the medication she'd taken. She said that she definitely took all of her anti-malaria pills, but there was one small thing she'd forgotten. Just before she came home from Ghana, she forgot to use bug spray when she took a hike in the rainforest, and she did remember getting bit by mosquitoes. but she always thought she was safe as long as she took her pills. Dr. Sood said that normally the medicine she was taking was all you needed to protect yourself from getting malaria. But Kelly was just very unlucky. The mosquito that bit her had carried a much more potent form of malaria that overwhelmed both the anti-malaria medicine and her own body's defenses. And before long, the malaria parasite had gone to work destroying her red blood cells and cutting off oxygen to her organs, which had caused really intense hallucinations, like that weird voice she was hearing. That was just a product of malaria, and then also jaundice. 4 days after the blood exchange procedure, Kelly went home, and in the following weeks, she made a full recovery. Kelly returned to college in the fall to continue pursuing her degree in anthropology, and she still has very fond memories of her time studying abroad in Ghana, despite the fact that that trip nearly killed her. Just after 6 p.m. on December 27, 2015, a woman named Sarah Robinson was getting ready inside of her cabin on the 7th floor of a massive cruise ship. She and her boyfriend were going to dinner that night with Sarah's parents in one of the restaurants on board the ship. And in fact, this entire trip, this whole vacation, was actually a big gift from Sarah's parents to Sarah and her boyfriend. And so far, the trip had been totally amazing. I mean, all 4 of them, Sarah, her boyfriend, and Sarah's parents, had got to go swimming and drink great drinks and have great food, and it was just like a total dream. But now they only had 1 night left, tonight, and they wanted to make the most of it. And their plan was to go to the big buffet that the ship offered and just totally indulge on the amazing food and just have some laughs, share stories, and then the next day they'd wake up in the Florida port that they left from, and the trip would be over. But for now, they had this 1 dinner left. And so, after Sarah and her boyfriend were all ready, they left their cabin and they met Sarah's parents out in the hallway, and then Sarah led the way towards the stairwell that would bring them up to the 10th floor where the restaurant was that they were going to. Once they reached the 10th floor, Sarah could see right in front of her the entrance to this restaurant. And so she, her boyfriend, and her parents, all behind her, began walking towards the restaurant. And to get there, they would have to walk past this sort of lobby right in front of the restaurant, where there was this elevator bank that would go down to the lobby and all the other floors. And so, Sarah and her family, they walked past these elevators, and as they did, Sarah began to hear what sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. But that didn't make any sense because that whole day the weather had been beautiful and clear, and Sarah, when she heard this sound, she instinctively kind of looked around the corner out one of the windows, and she looked out into the night, and it was still clear and beautiful out. So this could not be rain. And so Sarah, she turned around and she looked at her boyfriend and her parents with a sort of quizzical look, being like, "Do you hear this? Like, what is that sound?" And they clearly had heard it too, and were looking back at her like, "I don't know." But before they could even start to discuss whatever this was, a woman who they didn't know, who was standing near these elevators as well, began to scream. It would turn out, just a few minutes before this woman began to scream, the cruise ship's chief electrician, 66-year-old Jose Sandoval Opazo, had begun doing routine maintenance on the elevators that were located a few floors below the 10th floor, but still within that same elevator bank that could bring you up to the 10th floor where that restaurant was. And while Jose was performing this very routine and quick maintenance on the elevator, something strange happened. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand a little bit about Jose and the other electricians on board this cruise ship. So there was oftentimes a lot of very quick and easy maintenance that would need to get done on these elevators, which would involve going into the elevator shaft to do it. But again, these are very short bursts, in and out, very easy to do. All the electricians know how to do it. And the procedure was to actually fully shut down that elevator, like completely, and then go inside and do the maintenance, and then go through the process of starting the elevator all over again. But that was so disruptive to the flow of traffic on the ship each day, and it was just kind of a hassle. And so Jose and the other electricians had come up with this sort of workaround that didn't require them to shut down the elevator, because again, that was just a huge pain and they didn't want to do it. And so what they would do is they would wait until the elevator car within the shaft they needed to do maintenance on was at some other level, like on floor 2, and they would go into the elevator on like floor 8 and then quickly do the maintenance on the inside of the shaft or whatever it is they had to do. Or sometimes they would actually have to do repairs on the elevator car itself, in which case they would just kind of go in real quick, do the repairs, get out again. But all of it was predicated on just kind of knowing where the elevator car was in the shaft and being really quick, in and out. And so Jose and the other electricians had done this many times and there was no issues. But on this day, Jose, he got into the elevator shaft to make these simple repairs. And so he actually was standing inside of the shaft on top of the elevator car that was down, a few levels down from 10. And he began making these repairs. And suddenly the car lurched into action because a guest unknowingly had walked into the elevator car and pressed floor 10. And so Jose is on this elevator car that starts moving, and before he can even figure out what's going on, the little opening that he used, the kind of service entrance into the shaft, had been covered up by the elevator car. And so his exit was now gone, and he was now relatively slowly moving up the shaft. Now, Jose would have no idea when this car was going to stop, but if it went to the top, he'd get crushed, and he knew it. And so in kind of a moment of panic, Jose attempted to step to the side to somehow go between the wall and the elevator. It was like he had nowhere to go and he knew it and he just took that path. But there was an inch of space between the wall and the car. And so the second he did that, the car kept going and it sucked him down into that space and just destroyed him. And so by the time this elevator car reached its destination, the 10th floor, and that guest got off the elevator car, by this point, Jose's body had been totally destroyed and all of his blood was dripping down the elevator shaft, splattering into the walls and hitting the ground, and it sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. And so that's what Sarah and her family were hearing. And then the reason that woman started screaming is she was the first one who turned and saw all this blood coming down the front of the elevator doors. Medics would arrive quickly on the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Jose was deceased. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2017, I was really struggling with my mental health. I had just left the military after almost a decade of service, and I was just really struggling to reintegrate into society, and it was making me totally depressed. Now, I had a great support system around me. I had my wife, my kids, my parents, my siblings, friends, but I had such dark thoughts and feelings. I just didn't feel comfortable sharing them with people I loved. I was worried it would kind of upset them, and they'd also view me differently in a negative way, which, by the way, this is a very common train of thought amongst people who are feeling depressed. So I didn't realize how common it was, but there you go. Lots of people feel this way, and I did too. However, even though I didn't tell my family or friends anything, they eventually picked up that something was wrong with me, and they actually approached me and said, look, I really think you need to see someone. I think you need to see a therapist. And honestly, I was ready for that help, and so I did seek out a therapist. And my goodness, unburdening myself of all that horrible darkness inside of me to a trained, neutral third party was so cathartic. And of course, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're really struggling right now and you're kind of holding it all in, you really ought to give therapy a try. And a really easy entry into therapy is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is fill out a short survey online, and then within about 48 hours, you get paired up with a licensed therapist, and then it's up to you how you communicate and how often. Also, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional cost. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who can support you all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or select MrBallen during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. At around 2 p.m. on September 24th, 2017, a 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, and they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see just barely the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder, staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, and it was really hot out, Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple and this pool. And he was yelling to his friends as he did, like, hey, I'm going to go swimming. And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it. And he got to the steps and he immediately took off his shirt and he pulled his phone out of his pocket and he put it on the steps. And then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down and jumping in too. And so pretty soon, this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now, to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple, and many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they'd all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water. And Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas like, hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing? And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the, 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now, like, yeah, get in here, man. And Vishwas, he's like, okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, memorialize this amazing trip. And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group, and he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who were totally not paying attention to him. And he's saying, hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo, gather up, I'll take a photo of all of us. And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame, and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled, and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media and, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also that picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took, selfie style, in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took. He got all his buddies in frame. Everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left, and many of them included his friends. And they were walking around, talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and speed walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends and he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. and he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool and he showed the professor what he had found. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too, and right away he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple, I still can't figure it out. And so the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police, and so the police came out to the temple not long after that. And the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool, stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool, but they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment when Sanjay heard that splashing that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend Vishwas was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool, was because Vishwas did not know how to swim, but he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it. And so maybe he was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted, like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, but he yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on, dude, get in here. Come swimming with us." Because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, "Hey, let's take that photo," he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow, except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo, just nobody knew it. And so obviously an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor, they called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased. Late on the morning of June 27th, 1957, a 25-year-old Austrian mountain climber named Kurt Diemberger plunged his ice axe into the deep snow ahead of him and then used the axe to pull himself up and over a big ice clump. Kurt was totally physically and mentally exhausted by this point and only wanted to stop for like 2 seconds just to catch his breath. But he knew that was just not an option. Kurt and his climbing partner, a 32-year-old man named Herman Buell, were climbing one of the tallest mountains in the world, called Chogalisa, which is located in northern Pakistan. And they were doing this climb all alone. It was just those two, and they had virtually no safety equipment. Now, for reference, this was not normal. Anybody who climbed Chogalisa did so with Sherpas and guides and oxygen masks. I mean, this was a dangerous climb, and so serious measures had to be taken to ensure it was safe. But Kurt and Herman felt like, that takes all the fun out of mountain climbing. There has to be, like real risk here for this to be worth doing. And also, critically, Kurt and Herman were well aware of the fact that if they successfully climbed Chogalisa with no safety equipment, so what they were planning to do, that would be a new world record because nobody had ever done that before on this mountain. And so that felt like a really cool reason to go for this. And when they began their journey a few days earlier, when they began the climb, it had still felt like a great idea because the weather forecast was perfect for the rest of the time they expected to be on the mountain. However, earlier that morning, Kurt had turned around to talk to Herman, and he noticed off to the south was a kind of ominous dark cloud making its way toward them. Now, obviously, when you're on the ground and you look up and you see a dark cloud, you think, okay, it might storm, or it's actively storming. Maybe it's rain, maybe it's snow, but it's probably not a big deal unless it's like a tsunami or a hurricane or something, but dark clouds are just not really a big deal. But when you are 4 miles up one of the most treacherous mountains in the world, you got no other people with you, you got no safety equipment, and you see a dark cloud coming your way, yeah, that's terrifying. Because storms have been killing mountain climbers basically for as long as mountain climbing has been a thing. And so when Kurt and Herman saw this cloud, even though the weather forecast had been good, they knew that there was a real chance a storm was going to hit them before they reached the summit. And so they had to make a choice. Abort the mission now, go back to camp, and potentially give up on this climb altogether, thereby not getting the world record. Or they could risk it and just try to speed their way up to the summit before the storm arrived. And because Kurt and Herman were actually within about 1,000 feet to the summit when Kurt noticed this dark cloud, they decided, you know what, let's just risk it. We can get up there to the summit, get this thing done before this cloud ever gets to us. And so that was the decision they made. And it was also why Kurt and Herman knew there was no way they could slow down even for a second, because basically this was a sprint to the top. And if they slowed down, they might die. And so, panting and exhausted with the wind whipping up like mad, Kurt and Herman just kept moving up that mountain as fast as they possibly could. But when they got about maybe 500 feet away from the summit, so they're really close at this point, something changed. As Kurt was about to bring his axe back down into the snow to, pull himself up one more step, he suddenly realized he couldn't see the mountain in front of him. Like there was nothing. It was just pure white all around him. He couldn't even see the sky. It was like he was just in this void all of a sudden. And the reason for this is because that dark cloud had caught up to them. They were literally inside of the cloud. That's why they couldn't see anything. And so from behind Kurt, even though he can't see anything, he could hear Herman desperately screaming up to him, "Hey, we've got to turn around right now!" And Kurt obviously knew, yeah, it's too late. We are not going to make the summit. We got to go. Kurt knew Herman was right. I mean, this is an absolute crisis. If the storm that's basically brewing all around them didn't kill them, certainly the result of the storm would. I mean, all the snow that's going to land is going to fill in their tracks, and it would be nearly impossible to find your way back down again. And so this was like, we totally miscalculated, turn around and get out of here as fast as possible. And so that's what Kurt and Herman began to do. As fast as they could, they began going down the mountain, following along their tracks they had left on the way up. And pretty quickly, Kurt and Herman began making serious progress. And so Kurt was starting to feel optimistic that, maybe they had managed to escape this just in time. But right at that moment, the ground underneath Kurt began to vibrate. Then Kurt looked down, and even though his visibility was basically nothing, he could tell from his legs that the ground was basically shifting underneath him. And then suddenly Kurt felt this feeling that you get when you're on like a carnival ride and you're dropped, that feeling in your stomach that you're falling. He got that because the ground underneath him just gave way. It was an avalanche. And so in absolute desperation, Kurt, who knows he's about to be sucked into an avalanche, he just jumped. Like as far away from the mountain as he possibly could, kind of at an angle to the right, like he was leaping up and out of the avalanche and over to the right. But you got to remember, he's on this really steep slope. This is not like jumping on flat ground where you jump up and just return to where you jumped from. He's on a slope. So when he jumped out and to the right, it was like he was jumping off a building. He fell something like 30 or so feet before he hit the ground again. But when Kurt hit the ground, he kind of expected to be gobbled up by the snow and keep being sucked down the mountain, but he wasn't. He hit the ground and didn't move. And then he kind of sat up and he looked around and he realized he had successfully jumped out of the avalanche. He had done it. He saved himself. And so he began looking around. The visibility is still terrible, but it's a little bit better because now the avalanche has basically gone down the mountain. The storm is kind of passing, and so the visibility is decent. And, Kurt, he's looking around, screaming out for Herman. He doesn't see him. And then it's like suddenly the visibility just opened up, and Kurt was able to look to his left where the avalanche had gone. And as he was looking, he saw what looked impossible. Basically, the land where they had been walking down this mountain was gone. It was like the avalanche had removed that part of the mountain. And so Kurt is basically laying in the snow on the edge of a new cliff where the avalanche had basically broken away the mountain. And so he's looking into this crevasse where the avalanche went and thinking, I can't believe how lucky I am, but I gotta go find Herman. And so Kurt stands up, and he's pretty battered from this 30-foot fall, but he's got adrenaline pumping through him, so he feels pretty good. And he scrambles his way 30 feet back up the mountain to this ridgeline where he originally jumped out of the avalanche, hoping when he got up there that he might find some sign of where Herman went to, because they were pretty close together when the avalanche started. But when he got up there was no sign of Herman, and he turned around and looked back down the mountain, and he couldn't see Herman anywhere. But when he turned back around, looking now back up the mountain, so in the direction of where they had originally intended to hike, and then where they had to come back down from when they were in the cloud, he noticed that he could see very easily their tracks, he and Herman's tracks. And so with his eyes, he just kind of tracked these tracks all the way down the mountain to where he was. And as he did this, he noticed something. At first, it was like his brain couldn't compute what he was seeing. But after a moment, he knew. Here is a photo of what Kurt would have seen. However, keep in mind, this was not a photo Kurt took, and it's also from a slightly farther away perspective. But conceptually, this really is what Kurt saw that told him what happened to Herman. So in this photo, you can see the mountain and the summits at the top, and there's a trail that goes straight down and then appears to diverge, where there's tracks that go to the left from our perspective, the viewer's perspective. They go to the left around that cliff line, and the other set of footprints that disappear off the cliff. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, the footprints that go to the left are Kurt's footprints. He just magically jumped and landed on the absolute edge of where this avalanche was going to happen, and Herman is the other set of prints. And so when that avalanche started, there was nowhere for Herman to go, and he was sucked into that avalanche and dragged over 1,000 feet down the mountain, and his body was never recovered.
Like a spark in the dark, just a flash of a smile, common ground, we walk a while, share a look, share a laugh.
In the late summer of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking, and there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered this spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. And I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also, Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point, Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead, she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune-telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor, they just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonarda was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months? Leonarda had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonarda had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonarda realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonarda turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war, and he was going to die. Unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. So, for the next several days, Leonarda did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonarda's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonarda decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonarda decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonarda, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonarda thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonarda reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man, who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonarda did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around, he's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart, he means well, I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him, I want to marry him, I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him, and before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help in setting them up. And so Leonarda was obviously thrilled not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonarda, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son. And so I need to find somebody else I can help. So in September of 1940, Leonarda began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonarda reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda. But Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio, saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca, and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer? Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again, they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonardo's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonardo was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonardo, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonardo, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonardo approached him and said, "I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes." And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious. She seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her. And so he said, okay. And so Leonardo washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes. And then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonardo was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonardo would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonardo's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, "Hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are." And so Leonardo, she was totally shocked by this. And she said, "No, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them." And then Leonardo went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, "Look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing?" And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonardo that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonardo that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonardo was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonardo was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonardo's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonardo that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these 3 women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonardo's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those 3 women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonardo's house, Leonardo walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonarda looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonarda hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room, he sat down across the table from Leonarda, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonarda said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonarda loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonarda's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out.